I recently acquired a new roommate. The entire situation should have never happened, but I needed someone to help with the rent. So a Craigslist posting later, he moved in. His name was Greg, and he disclosed to me that he did have some strange sleeping behaviors. Sleep talking, sleepwalking, and night terrors. Funny thing was that I had a history of sleepwalking myself, but only on rare occasions. The first incident occurred about 1 week later when I had heard him screaming in the middle of the night. Since we both sleep in separate rooms on different sides of the house, the scream sounded distant, but enough to scare me so much that I ran to check on him. As I got closer to his bedroom, he stopped screaming, so I just went back to bed. For the next month, he had no issues. I noticed that he had no friends or family that would visit, and I never saw or heard him on the phone or texting. Then another random night, Greg started screaming. The same thing. I got up and started to go to his room, but he'd stop. Then one night I was awoken by screaming in my bedroom. I couldn't see anything in the panic, so I turned on the bedside lamp, and he was at the foot of my bed wearing some sleeping clothes, athletic shorts and a t-shirt. Scared me, so I started screaming and woke him up. He apologized and went back to bed. Then the scariest thing happened. About 2 nights later, I awoke to clanking. Sounded like tools and hammers tapping. I turned on the light to see Greg kneeling down in a corner working on something with his hands. A few seconds after turning the light on, Greg froze, then slowly turned his upper body around and stared blankly at me while I laid in bed. I was beyond creeped out, so I slowly slid out of bed and left the house. After sleeping in my truck down the road in an empty church parking lot, I returned to the house at about 8 in the morning. Greg was gone. All of his belongings were gone. No signs of him anywhere. It was like he never lived there. I don't know any of his friends or family, so I had no one to call about him. Days turned to weeks, weeks into months. When I moved out after the lease was up, I was moving my furniture out of my bedroom. In the corner of the room where I last saw Greg kneeling down, I realized the floor vent for the air conditioning was loose. Inside the floor vent was an envelope with a ton of pictures of me sleeping. The pictures had handwritten dates and times written on the back of the pictures. The only other item was a whittled down wooden broom handle brought to a point. I truly believe Greg was preparing to kill me that night, and he realized it. Because it was the sleepwalking Greg that was going to do it, he left to save my life. It appears Greg had been coming to my room almost nightly, and he was working on making the broom handle a stabbing weapon, and I had never heard. Not until the last night I saw him. Before any judgment is placed, I would like to say that I wasn't in the best state of mind prior nor during the situation. I just went through a particularly difficult breakup, a suicide attempt, moved back in with a parent, and then experienced a sexual assault by a trusted friend. I didn't have a good judge of character, and I was by far hitting my rock bottom. After several months at my mother's home and after the sexual assault, I realized I desperately needed to get out of that atmosphere and try to get back up on my feet. I found a cheap home for rent and began my life all over again. It wasn't the nicest place, certainly not as warm and comforting as my last place, but it would do temporarily. Shortly after moving in, still not in the right mindset, and with a huge lack of self-care, I began using almost anything I could get my hands on. Many psychedelics, acid, mushrooms, and MDMA. Anyone who has experienced MDMA can tell you it gives you this incredible sense of happiness and content, which at the time I had neither. These short-term bouts of false happiness sucked any remaining serotonin from my brain, and it left me feeling just, if not more, empty inside. On top of that, after my suicide attempt, I was abruptly taken off all of my medications, as I used them to hurt myself prior. This meant my sleeping medication, and with it trickled down that familiar insomnia. Then my SSRI, which when stopping abruptly can exceedingly send you into a state of manic depression and confusion. And last but not least, my anxiety medication. I relied on this for years. It took me out of my agoraphobia, and it helped me with my PTSD triggers, which having my attacker live just several blocks away on the same very street as another individual who abused me from ages 11 to 14, I simply lost all abilities to cope. After some time of intense withdrawals from my anxiety medication and even experiencing a seizure, I began to buy pills. The only ones available to me were Xanax, which I quickly developed a tolerance to, and in my worst was taking anywhere from 12 to 20 milligrams a day. Because of the Xanax abuse, there were many things that I didn't completely recall, such as my wedding. It was to a bass-playing musician that I had only known for a month, as well as of the month we spent together. My most vivid memories were lying on the couch watching The Office on Netflix religiously, shaking and sweating in between buys and re-ups from my pill dealer. I began drinking heavily and hanging out in the wrong crowd as well. The grunge/punk crowd. The ones that couch surfed much of their lives, destroyed things in their path, didn't work, and commonly used others, burning each individual bridge as they passed. As I was in no state to actually care, I enjoyed their company. And one in particular I'll refer to as Sideshow Bob started to become what I thought was my best friend, even wearing a dress at my wedding as my maid of honor. He often wore women's clothes, not because he was transgender, but because he simply liked to. Some made fun of him for this, but I thought it was cool that he didn't care what others thought. He really seemed to have a kind and goofy nature about him. That I admired, but as a man that wore women's clothes, he'd often get into my closet. I'd like to add that Bob also had very poor hygiene. He wore no deodorant, he showered rarely, and his feet. Those feet left a smell that permanently absorbed into the carpet fibers that stayed, even when I moved out. He would often hop off the couch around 4 p.m. or so and rush to his pizza delivery job. He never stopped to shower or even brush his teeth. He'd even wake up and throw back on the same uniform that he'd been wearing for weeks, which stunk of cheap weed, pizza grease, and feet. On New Year's Eve 2016, I left my at the time husband. After a serious withdrawal and being around him completely sober, it became obvious he was using meth. I was suspicious of it before, as I used it too when I was much younger, along with nearly half of my family members. You can always sense it. He knew before marrying me that this was the big no for me. My brother in prison, my father's heart attack and death all contributed to meth use. He knew this when he married me, yet kept it a secret. I do blame myself partly for this. It's the kind of thing that occurs when you marry a stranger. About a year later, he had passed away from a shot laced with fentanyl. They found his body 5 days later. After the separation from my husband, I had allowed Bob to stay. He didn't have a room. He slept on the couch. He didn't contribute to groceries or bills, and quite frankly turned my home into a disgusting mess. But since my OCD seemed to have dissolved into my drinking, and I preferred not being alone with my thoughts, I didn't really mind. Within a week of leaving my husband, Bob grew increasingly more obsessed with the thought of us being together. I made it very clear I had no intentions with him and I valued our friendship. Not to mention, I was about to experience my first divorce and all the shame that came along with it. I started avoiding the home. I started avoiding him. Every time I'd return home, he'd be there, in tears. Some days I'd find him not only in my clothes, but in my bed. Eventually, he quit his job to have a better chance of seeing me. He'd follow me room to room, demanding to know why it is that I can't see us together. Eventually, I told him if it didn't stop, he needed to leave. But he was quick to throw back into my face that legally he was a tenant in my home and that he needed 30 days notice. "I'm not going anywhere. You're stuck with me," he told me. Things grew much more aggressive, and I grew more uncomfortable and afraid by the days. His tears turned to anger. His questions turned to screaming. One very vivid memory I have is him staring me directly in the eyes, red-faced, spit flying, screaming, "You know, I am just so sick of being rejected by women." He was no longer my goofy drinking buddy. He was someone that I absolutely could not be around. A police officer suggested that I get a restraining order to get him off the premises, which I did. Then I kept the doors locked. His only few possessions in my home were a guitar and an amp, which I had placed on the back porch that notified him. He immediately tried to break into the home, kicking the old front door with such force I could see it begin to crack at the deadbolt, leaving dark shoe prints on the cracked white paint. The police had trouble serving him. He quit his job. He had no actual address, although I had provided them with his car description, license plate, and his friends' addresses. Morning, noon, and night, I'd find myself crying pressed up against that door, hoping that it wouldn't break open. Every time I called the police, he had already left. I'd find myself up at night staring out the windows, watching that loud green car of his drive by, feeling my pulse rise, phone in hand. For weeks, I received surprise visits from him. Most were terrifying. Occasionally, some were thought out. One evening, he had a mutual friend knock on the door, which I happily opened, only for him to quickly jump out from behind the door and attempt entering. I moved as swiftly and strongly as I could to slam the door and lock it, kicking again, calling 911 again. He'd leave again. After a few months, he moved on. He found a girlfriend who'd kicked him out quite quickly. He responded by beating her unconscious and attempting to cut her throat. Luckily, a neighbor heard the commotion and Bob quickly ran. He got off easy on those charges. But of course, if you Google his name, you see the repeated charges of serious assault. I spoke with his exes. I saw the photos of what he had done to their faces, their bodies. All I can think about is how that could have been me. The last time I saw him was back in my hometown at the local grocery store, as I had waited for a cup of coffee after a tiring 10-hour shift at my job. He nodded with a kind smile. I froze, heart-throbbing, hand shaking. It was that day that I'd moved an hour and a half away. It's this month that I'll be moving back. Names have been changed to protect the deceased, and for anonymity as well. After high school many years ago, I was in a bad place. My guardian had kicked me out after graduation. She didn't help me find a place to stay, so I lived in my car for a couple of months. I met some heavy metal dudes at work one day. I'd seen them around town and all of my other friends knew who they were. Everyone loved them. We became friends over a couple of months, and they offered for me to move in with them. I agreed. Looking back on it now, I wish I had just stayed in my car. My two main roommates were brothers named Jack and Cody. They were in a band. They also believed in the occult and anything of that sort. I never really believed in that stuff, but I'm not one to tell someone what they should believe. They had me live with them rent-free for several months, so who was I to complain? Being the only female in a house full of young men, I was always looking over my shoulder. You never know who you can trust. Turns out I was right to worry. Over time, their friends had started to stay with us for longer periods of time, sometimes weeks. Their friends were another group of brothers that they had gone to school with. There were 5 brothers in total, but only 2 stayed with us consistently. The younger brother Sam was very polite. He cleaned up after himself and he always helped with the household chores. The other brother Kevin had a laundry list of mental problems. He had apparently done some bad drugs back in the day, and it had developed into what seemed like psychosis of the religious sort. He had done time in prison for assaulting a woman with the Bible. He would often look you in the eyes and tell you he could see how you would die. Once he told me that I was possessed by a demon and that I needed my soul to be cleansed. Everyone in the house knew that he had these problems, but he was their friend. They had helped him through the hard times and gave him a place to stay. Otherwise, he would be on the streets. I was always on guard around him after the things he told me. No one else seemed to be as concerned as I was. They really should have been. One day I was sleeping and my phone rang. It was my boss. He asked if I could come into work an hour early. It was only 12 p.m. I was broke and, well, I had nothing better to do, so I said yes. I got up and began getting ready to leave. I walked out into the living room to see Sam and Jack sitting on the couch, while Kevin sat on the floor by the TV. He was watching scripture videos on YouTube, some real end-of-the-day stuff. That was fairly common, so I went about my business. I just said goodbye and left for work. My shift at work was almost complete when the phone rang. My boss answered, handed the phone to me, and said, "For you." I was just a cashier, so I assumed it was a friend that couldn't reach me on my phone. I answered the phone and I had heard a man's voice that I didn't recognize.
"Hi, this is Detective Nelson. Something happened at your apartment today, and we need you to come to the station to talk about it."
I left for work immediately. I had assumed one of the brothers had been arrested for drug dealing or something. I was very wrong. I got to the station and was buzzed in. An officer escorted me to a small cold room with a camera. He gave me a bottle of water and left me by myself for about 30 minutes. My mind was racing, thinking about what could have happened. He came back in, and he informed me that Kevin had stabbed and killed Jack at around 1 p.m. I was shocked. I had just left the house an hour before it happened, and everything seemed fine. I asked if there had been a fight. The detective informed me that there hadn't been a fight, but it seemed to have happened out of nowhere, whatever it was. I gave my statement to the police and left with nowhere to go, still in shock and confused out of my mind. Our apartment was a crime scene, so I went to another friend's house to watch the news report since the police wouldn't give me any information on the case. Over the next couple of days, the information began to be released. Kevin hadn't just stabbed Jack once, not twice, but he had stabbed him over and over and nearly decapitated him. After the murder, he ran down the road still holding the murder weapon. He called 911 and then informed them what he had done. I watched the news report in horror. We had known he was unstable, but this, he had fully confessed to the brutal murder and he provided the police with his notebooks. He had apparently been planning to murder all of his brothers, my roommates, and me. He thought we were possessed by demons, and this was the only way to free us. Luckily, none of his other intended victims were there that day. Sam unfortunately witnessed the murder, but luckily he escaped. If I hadn't gotten that call from my boss, I can honestly say that I wouldn't be alive today. Okay, so this is gonna be a long one about my creepy uncle who used all kinds of weird technology to spy on anyone he could, including my family and I. So my family of 5 happily welcomed my uncle, who's my mom's brother, into our home as a roommate a little over 10 years ago, maybe even longer. We'll call him David for the purpose of this post. David, over 40 years old at the time, was very kind at first. He was also hardworking, and to himself for most of the years that he had spent in our home. He's always been really interested in technology and spyware. If it had a camera or could listen and record, he was highly interested in it. He was pretty private about his room and computers, and we never invaded his personal space because he never gave us a reason to. As time passed, I'd say 6 years, we noticed his behavior got a little more introverted and private. He was extremely depressed and paranoid, but he refused to address these issues, so we left him alone for the most part. As far as I know, he was involved with chat rooms and listening devices. He started drinking pretty heavily, and would sometimes steal my mother's prescription pills to catch a high. Again, these things were pretty much touch and go, and no one in the household really knew how to address his worsening behavior. My dad would occasionally question him and his actions. We don't allow alcohol in the home because my dad used to struggle with substance abuse himself, and he's been living sober for quite some time now. Anyways, we gave him an ultimatum: stop drinking or leave. This worked for some time, but he would just hide from us when he drank, lock himself in his basement room for hours, sometimes even days. We knew he was drinking though because at random hours of the day you could hear anger-fueled screams coming from his room in the basement level. That or loud techno music that would thump until 12 a.m. The last 2 years specifically have been really hostile and strange between him and our family. Anytime he would return home, he'd be highly intoxicated and ready for bed. None of us would interfere because it wasn't uncommon to get into an argument with him about his odd behavior and heavy drinking. I was a 19-year-old female at the time, and my father was over 45. He became really hostile towards both of us. He would purchase a lot of strange devices designed for listening or watching, which made us all intensely uneasy and on edge. My father told me that once he came home with these new sunglasses and excitedly told my dad that they're really great for watching people, and that he had spent the whole day at the park lurking on strangers. I don't believe that he had any malicious intent towards anyone, but his fascination with spying was honestly unnerving and a big red flag. We demanded that he leave and seek residence elsewhere, gave him a deadline, and even offered him helping finding a new place to live. He ignored us for weeks and pretty much refused to leave our home. My mother didn't know how to handle the situation, especially because it was her own brother. She feels like we've betrayed our family or forsaken him. Anyways, it wasn't uncommon to find small strange devices all around the house that were absolutely unexplainable if you've never seen them before. Things like movement tracking devices, infrared cameras, or mics that would record any audio that occurred in the room it was placed in. He also had control of our Wi-Fi, and I'm positive that he had access to our browser search history or Wi-Fi related information in general. If we confronted him about his behavior or asked him to pack up and leave, he would threaten us. He would always say things like,
"I see everything you do. I heard what you said the other night."
Although never knowing what kind of information he was trying to blackmail us with, we were all very uncomfortable with the idea of our privacy being breached. Not having anything to hide though, his threats were pretty hollow and ineffective. My dad wanted to test David and see if he was using devices at our home while he was away from the house. My dad would wait for David to leave in the morning and go to work, and my dad would then shut off the Wi-Fi, sometimes even the power breaker, to see if he would react while away from the house. Sure enough, David would return to our house immediately and question him.
"Why's the Wi-Fi off? Why's the power off?"
My dad would ask him how he knew about the Wi-Fi being off while he was away from the home. Strange behavior, needless to say. Each time my dad did this, he would return to the house immediately to recover the Wi-Fi and his devices. If he was home and the Wi-Fi went down, this man would have the ultimate tantrum. Everyone would undergo a serious interrogation and be bombarded with accusations involving the Wi-Fi not working. He began threatening my dad specifically, and he would show him his weird spyware that he purchased. David would place the device against the wall and he could hear anyone speaking throughout the home. So much as faint whispers could be heard from the device. David wanted us to know that he could hear everything that we were doing. It was a scare tactic in order for him to remain in the house with us. When he continued to refuse to leave our home after being given a proper eviction notice, we had to seek assistance from the police and court to have him legally removed from our home. We also changed all of the locks in our home to prevent any unwelcome visits from David. Anyways, he's been out of our home for nearly 6 months, and we're still experiencing strange things that have us all on the edge of our seats. Strange faint beeps from different areas of the house, unknown Bluetooth devices that are supposedly 10 meters or less away, and wires that run all around the house. I think we're all just paranoid from his consistent spying over the years, but sometimes I still come across strange unidentifiable devices all around the home. Most of them look inactive and not in use, but I end up smashing them regardless. David tried to insist that we keep his Wi-Fi service after he left, but we had no interest in using his Wi-Fi and immediately removed his router from our home. I discovered that David had climbed through one of our backyard basement windows into the home at some point. I only noticed that someone had been in the backyard because of the fresh snow, which revealed his enormous boot-like footprints. The night that the snow fell, no one was home until hours later. My brother had moved out nearly 2 months before. My mother returned home from work at 3 a.m. My dad returned home at around 12 a.m. My sister had been staying with a friend for the weekend, and I returned home after 7 a.m. after work. I go into the backyard every day to throw a ball for the dog, and when I came across the prints, I immediately felt scared because no one in my family wears a size 12 shoe, and after questioning everyone in the home, they all assured me that they had not been in the backyard as of last night. It was obvious that someone, most likely David, had entered our home through the backyard. For what, we don't know. We haven't found any changes in our home since his unwelcome entry. We have filed a restraining order against him for safety measures, but to no avail. He's still spamming my mother with cryptic texts and threats over the phone. We're so thankful that David is no longer in our home, but somehow he's still traumatizing us with his all-seeing eyes.